This week, I'm speaking with a graduate from the Career Pivot community, Vicki Soll. Vicki wandered around a lot in her career in the high-tech industry. She did okay, but was never really happy. Vicki has found her happy place in her early 60s, teaching, training, and developing curriculum targeting older adults. Cue the music.
Welcome to the Repurpose Your Career podcast, brought to you by Career Pivot. This podcast is where those of us in the second half of life come together to discuss how to repurpose our careers for the 21st century. Come listen to career experts give you proven strategies. Listen to people like you tell their stories on how they repurpose their careers. And finally, get your questions answered. Your host, Mark Miller, has made 6 career pivots over the last 30 years. He understands this is not about jumping out of the frying pan into a fire, but rather to create a plan where you make clear, actionable steps or pivots to a better future career. Are you ready to repurpose your career?
Welcome to episode 260 of the Repurpose Your Career podcast. My name is Mark Miller, and I'll be your host every Monday for discussion on what it's like to repurpose your career. This week, I'm speaking with a graduate from the Career Pivot community, Vicki Soll. Vicki wandered around a lot in her career in the high-tech industry, mostly as a trainer and curriculum designer, and she never really was happy. She did okay. Vicki has found her happy place in her early 60s, teaching, training, and developing curriculum targeting older adults. I think many of you will relate to her story as she kept taking jobs throughout her career that she knew weren't right for her because she just wanted the paycheck. What we did not mention is Vicki married later in life, and therefore for most of her career, she was completely dependent on her own income. I cannot tell you the number of highly successful single women in their 50s who I have coached who have this underlying fear of being a bag lady, alone and homeless. Making career decisions based on fear of running out of money is not uncommon in this demographic. Vicki has found her happy spot in her career, and it's been a real joy watching her shift her mindset over about 3 years. However, before we get to the episodes, let's have a word from our sponsor, Career Pivot. The Career Pivot membership community, which is what Vicki has graduated from, continues to help the members who are participating in this project grow and thrive. This is a community where everyone is there to help everyone else out, figure out what they want to do in the second half of life, and then make it happen. Let's hear what Debbie had to say about being part of the community.
I think one of the things I enjoyed the most was having a group of professional people that you could speak really candidly with about your situation. Obviously, we're all in the same boat, so it's not, talking to a coworker hoping nobody overhears, but it's just people that you can speak candidly with. You can hear about their journeys, their careers. Some people have some really interesting backgrounds. And you get some idea of the struggles they've faced and some of the things they've tried and what's worked, what hasn't. That can be helpful to get some direction, to apply to your own situation.
I'm recruiting new members for the next group. If you are interested in learning more about the endeavor, please go to careerpivot.com/community. Now, on to my discussion with Vicki Soll. Welcome to the Repurpose Your Career podcast. I have the real joy of having one of my former community members and one of my graduates, Vicki Soll, on the podcast. Vicki, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Mark. It's great to be here.
Vicki, how long were you in the community?
Probably about 3 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so what did you do in the first half of life?
In the first half of life, I followed similar to you, Mark. I just did what I was supposed to do, what I was told to do, and be a responsible human being. I worked in the high-tech industry for, 29 years or so. doing a number of different roles. I started off by doing technical support for a very small company. And then eventually I moved into training, doing technical training, which was more akin to my skill set, my personality. And then eventually that morphed into doing curriculum design or courseware development, as it was called back then. I think it's more instructional design. That's what it's called these days. And so I just kind of flowed, through those roles, always staying in the high tech industry. I did attempt to break out. At one point, I went and I received my master's degree in counseling psychology, thinking that I would be a therapist. And what I quickly realized is that I was single at the time, and it was going to take me a few years before I could hopefully, make a living doing that. So I really didn't have that luxury. And so I got pulled back into the high tech industry. So that's really where I spent, my formative years as an adult.
Now, what kind of education did you have?
So this is always interesting. On paper, it says I have a bachelor's in political science, but I actually made up my own major, and it was called comparative communist studies. So in college, I was actually taking the Russian language in addition to French, but I also took a smattering of classes in Russian history and culture, and so on. And that was more interesting to me than just going the, regular political science route. So that was my undergraduate degree.
So how did you get into tech?
How did I get, like everything else in my life, I kind of fell into it. And I should also mention, Mark, I have a master's degree in economics. So at one point I went back to school and I thought I wanted to go into forestry. So I actually have a graduate degree in that, but I never used it. I just really was interested in the area. But again, after going through the coursework, I realized, this is probably not for me. So I love being in school. But how did I get into the world of tech? As I mentioned, I kind of fell into it. I was working for a bank, and we were on these dummy terminals. And I remember there was a gentleman sitting with our group who was a contractor, and he was working on spreadsheets, Lotus 1, 2, 3 spreadsheets. And he was...
I remember those.
Yes. And he was also creating graphs and, bar charts and all kinds of things. And I was fascinated. So I talked to him a little bit and I signed up for an evening course to learn, how to use Lotus 1, 2, 3, how to use computer graphics. And I slowly, kind of made my way into the industry. I kind of talked my way into a job with Shearson Lehman Brothers back then as a network administrator, because I had somebody who believed in me. And so that was my real first foray into the tech industry.
Yeah, back then, being a network administrator is real different than it is today.
Oh, yes. Yes.
So when you joined the community, you were working for a medical device startup?
Right. Yes. I had been, moving throughout my career, working in different, tech companies. And at that point, I was working for a medical device company. They made, robots that did surgical robots. And it was very hardware focused, and I'm a software girl. So it wasn't a good fit for me. It was interesting. It was, I think as we talked about, Mark, I was more interested in the stories that people told me. And these are folks who would be in the operating rooms. They would be teaching, physicians, surgeons how to use the robots. I was more interested in their stories than anything else, than actually writing courses and instructional, design manuals for these folks. So
you left there, and what happened next?
I have to search my memory bank. So, So I left that job, and I was there for about, a year and 4 months or so before I went, this is not a good fit. And then I decided to try my hand at in the banking industry. So I had been speaking with someone at an organization that I was volunteering at, and they said, you know what? I was in the tech industry for 30 years. And a few years ago, I joined a credit union. I now work for a credit union in the IT department. It's so much better than corporate America. He's like, look into it. And I did, and I found a job as an instructor for a credit union in my area. And as I was interviewing for this job, I knew it wasn't a great fit, but the pay was great, and if they wanted me, and I said, I need a job, so let's give it a shot. And that was very typical of me, just having the money lead me rather than, something that was of more interest or more akin to, my skill set. So I was an instructor. I was a trainer for a credit union in the Bay Area.
So what I remember back then was you worried about money a lot.
Yes. Yep. That's always been a key influencer with me. This is why I used to take jobs, just, for the money. And I know I'm not the only person that does that, but against my better judgment, there were a number of jobs that I took because of the money.
Yep. So you get in, you're doing this instructor job for the credit union. And what happened then?
It was an interesting 5 months. I lasted a whole 5 months there. And it was a whole different world. It definitely is a kinder world, but I was used to the world of tech where I worked in beautiful offices with the latest and greatest furniture and gizmos and you name it. I was used to being able to, kind of come and go, do some remote work. And, I started this job on the first day. I remember asking my manager, so where's my laptop? And he's like, laptop? He's like, well, we don't have laptops. We have laptops in the training room, but you have a desktop. And I went, what? So they were about 25 years behind the curve. So there was no way to work even remotely. Everybody just came in, at a certain time, left at a certain time. And it was just very, very old school. The building was old. It was depressing. And it just was not the environment that I was used to, that I enjoyed, physically and also mentally. It was a whole different mental, space. There were people there who just had been there since high school, had kind of moved up through the ranks, and just not my people. That's the best way I can describe it.
And what's interesting is I'm looking over your right shoulder, and there is a typewriter.
On my virtual screen.
Yes, or your left shoulder, I guess.
Yeah, that was kind of close. It wasn't that far removed. So yeah. And also I did not really get along with my manager. And it really was not a good fit at all.
And what did you learn from that experience?
I have to listen to my gut, because when I went into the interview, I took a look around me. I went, oh God, this is a depressing place. And I just got this sinking feeling. And when I talked to my manager, I got the same sinking feeling. And I didn't listen to my instincts. I didn't listen to my gut.
So you left there. And what happened next?
My next pivot was with the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society. So about 5 weeks after I left my job, I was working at a new place. And this was through a girlfriend of mine who also worked for the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society. And this was something I had never done. I was working with the schools. So I was helping them promote their fundraising campaigns. So this is, the grammar schools and some of the middle schools. They ran their Pennies for Patients campaign, and I would work directly with teachers. Sometimes I work with the kids to help them explain, what is the program about? How are you going to run your campaign, your fundraiser? I had to do sales, which I'm not very good at all, but I thought it would be a good stretch. It's always good to learn a new skill. And, I got to do some training because I would go on site to the different schools and I would do a little presentation. And that was a learning experience because I hadn't really worked with school children before. And so you never knew what you were walking into. You had to be flexible. But that was my last job before the pandemic. And I worked 30 hours a week and I got health benefits. And the pay actually was not bad at all for what I was doing. So I think, though, what I took away from that job was, having worked only 30 hours, I saw a different path, a different way of being able, to live. I realized then that I just did not want to work full time anymore.
Well, the fact is, when you were working in tech, you weren't working just full time. You were working full time plus.
Yes, which happens, in a number of other jobs as well. But yeah, for many years.
Well, in most tech startups, and having been through two of them, there's very little boundaries between your personal life and your work life. And when you get your 50s and 60s, it's suddenly, oh gosh, this is exhausting.
Yeah, it is. And Mark, I'll tell you that when I was at the nonprofit, we have this idea, well, when you work for nonprofits, it's, 9 to 5, people don't have to work as hard. That is not true because, I was a contractor there, so I was working part-time, but the employees, they were just working as hard as I did when I was in tech, and they were getting paid much, much less. So that's a fallacy that you don't work as hard in nonprofit. I'm like, no, you do. You just get paid less.
Yeah. The thing to remember is, supposedly you are working on a mission that you care about, that you are driven by. The pandemic hit, and what happened to the leukemia lymphoma job?
Yeah, that went away. But what was interesting is I had about maybe 5 weeks left in my contract. And because of the pandemic, I was able to receive unemployment benefits for, a year or so. And it actually worked out really well for me. I, was able to receive unemployment. I had never received unemployment before. It was great. And I just took a break. I really did. I just thought about what I wanted to do next. And I think that for me, what really, really taught me is that I did actually take a job, a full-time job doing customer support. I did that for 3 weeks. And then I think that's when it just smacked me in the face. It's like, I'm not doing this anymore. I'm done. It was a knee-jerk reaction. I just, even though in my heart I was like, well, I said yes. The pay wasn't bad, but I think I realized after 3 weeks I was so miserable that I resigned. I felt terrible about it, but I knew it was the right thing. And that truly was a turning point for me, because that's when I realized I am not doing this anymore. I'm not working full time anymore. And I'm going to be doing something different.
Yeah. And who made you realize you were so miserable?
My husband.
Yes. I remember this story.
So every day during those 3 weeks, I would come out of my little, my study, and I would just be exhausted. I would be mentally exhausted. I would be physically exhausted. And my husband was watching this day after day. And finally, he said to me, "You know what, honey? I don't think this is working." He's like, "I really don't think this is the job for you. You are miserable." And I said, "Yes, you're right. I am." And that was really, as I said, it was a turning point for me.
Quick interruption. If you are enjoying this podcast, please rate it and review it on whatever podcast player you are using. And more importantly, would you mind telling a friend? Thanks, and back to the podcast episode. Well, just the fact that you realized, and you had to have someone kind of put it in your face, that you really are miserable. And if you're miserable after 3 weeks,
there was no way I was going to last.
You were going to last. Now, you went to work for a telehealth tech company that, if I remember correctly, had gone through such explosive growth that they were breaking.
Yeah. They really didn't have their procedures down very well. And it was enter this information here and in these other 3 spreadsheets. And I was like, okay, this is ridiculous.
I mean, that was a learning experience.
It was a good learning experience for me.
And what I want everyone to hear is Vicki learned something from each one of these. You didn't beat yourself up for, quote, failing. You just kept on moving on. Right?
Right. Yep. That's right. I know from our career pivot group, sometimes in my head, it's easy to think, oh, I failed at this. I failed at that. But time and time again, the group would always tell me, "You're such an inspiration to us. You try different things. You just go and do it." And I think that helped too, Mark, honestly, seeing a different point of view, because in my mind, it's like, this didn't work out. Okay. Another notch on the wall.
Well, sometimes you just need to try stuff, particularly when you've been ingrained in an environment, and tech it tends to be all in consuming.
Yeah, I agree.
So, okay. So you leave that. What happens next?
So I had been talking to one of my friends that I made a career pivot, Deb Livingston, and she had been telling me about Get Set Up. And we had talked about it before, but I really just wasn't quite ready to do anything. And we were talking about it again. I was kind of explaining where I was, what had been going on. And she said, "You know what, Vicki, I really think that you should consider being a guide with Get Set Up. There are a couple of classes that they need, technology classes to teach. You can create your own classes." And I will say that in the past few years, I had moved away from doing, instructional design, because I felt that, you had to be more of a designer now with all the e-learning modules that are so prevalent these days. Not only do you need to technically know how to use software, publishing software, but you also need to, or authoring software, I should say, you also need to be more of a designer. And that's not my thing at all. So I had really just started moving away from the instructional design part of my background, which is why I was searching for other things. But I always kept finding I kept coming back to it. It's like, well, would you design a talk? I'm like, oh, sure. And I just love doing the PowerPoint and how am I going to present this? And so it was always there with me, that interest. And I interviewed with Get Set Up, and I eventually was asked to come on board as a contract position as a guide. And what I've been finding is that I really enjoy the design part of it, what I always call is curriculum design, setting up, creating my classes and, figuring out how am I going to put this on a PowerPoint? What do I want to discuss? How am I going to demonstrate this? So I've been a guide with Get Set Up for a year and 2 months now. And thanks to Deb for bringing me on board. And it's been a really great experience for me because I wanted to throw out that curriculum design part of my background. I'm like, well, I don't feel like I can keep up. But with Get Set Up, I don't have to really keep up. I just have to use the skills that I have, and it's good enough.
So who are you teaching? And what are you teaching?
What am I teaching? So with Get Set Up, I'm a technology guide. And Get Set Up is a platform for quotes unquote older adults, which means people in their mid 50s, 55 and above. So most of the folks who are in my classes are in their 60s, 70s, 80s, some in their late 50s. And, I myself am going to be 63. So I'm teaching my contemporaries really, but I'm teaching older adults and I'm teaching them about technology. And it's really these hour-long sessions, classes, they're all virtual. And I pick a topic and I just walk them through, why you should use this. How do you use it? I do a lot of demonstrations, very similar to how I used to teach when I was, a technology trainer. But I have only an hour and it's very social. And my learners are really excited about learning and they're also very grateful. I get that immediate gratification right then and there during class.
Yeah, I remember you developing your Snapchat class and you learning it from your niece.
That's right. So some of the classes that I teach, whether they're Google applications, I teach some social media classes, Snapchat, Twitter, TikTok. And sometimes I've had to learn how to use these applications. But I do use Snapchat with my nieces and nephew to communicate with them. And I share that with my learners. It's like, if you think you're going to get an email from your grandkids, guess what? You're not. They're not going to pick up the phone. They're going to text you or they're going to Snapchat you or tweet you.
Yeah. What I observed in our What's Next meetings was as you were getting started, you just started to bloom because every time you finished a class, what you would tell us is, oh, everyone tells me how wonderful I am.
Yeah. They do. And it's lovely. It really is. But they also tell me how grateful they are for the platform. And, that just, nourishes my soul because people are truly learning how to use technology. And there is some fear there, but also what I'm finding in my classes, my learners are hungry for information. And I know as a society, we just have this picture of older adults being afraid of not wanting to learn, of being resistant. And there's a little bit of that, but a lot of my learners really just so want to embrace technology and want to learn. And so that's a fallacy, what we've concocted.
I will have on the podcast Becca Levy in a couple weeks, and she has a book called Breaking the Age Code. And one of the things she talks about is positive aging beliefs. When you take on those negative aging beliefs, like I can't do this technology stuff, or oh, these old people, they can't do it, which is bull hockey. And of course, the stuff you were teaching is not techie. It's how to use the technology.
Yes, which for me is so much more fulfilling than writing a class, developing a class for software developers on how to use Java helper functions to do things that nobody really cares about. Yes, it is. It's much more fulfilling. I like more the how-to part of it, definitely.
Yeah, my last corporate gig, I was developing courses on how video protocols pass through corporate firewalls.
Yeah, that's pretty fascinating.
Yeah. It has a lot of impact on society and brings anyway. So you've been doing this for a little over a year.
Yep.
You've added something else to your portfolio. And what's that?
I have. I am a technology trainer for a boot camp. And this boot camp is set up for entrepreneurs who are aged 50 and above, living in the city of San Francisco. Folks who are looking to either start a business or expand a business. It's a free boot camp, and this is being put on through a grant from the San Francisco Economic Council and Workforce, organization. And once a week, I am virtually teaching folks who are in the boot camp. There's about 18, 20 folks. And again, they're quote unquote older adults who are looking to start their business, expand their business. So I've had to learn a number of different tools, applications, so that I can teach it to them and support them. So I created a number of little how-to videos that are posted for them to have access to, but I also work with them once a week in a virtual classroom setting to explain to them, demonstrate, teach how to use the different tools that they'll need to work with during the boot camp. And I also host one-on-one support sessions. They can sign up with me. So I am doing that part-time as well. And that's been a lot of fun.
Yeah. One of the things I found that you discovered, particularly originally from the Get Set Up, but also from your volunteer work, is it's helping people who are older excites you. That's what energizes you.
Yes, it does. Working with this group, this population, I just didn't expect it, but in a way, I can't say that I'm really surprised that I've fallen in with this group because, I look back on my life, and whenever I've been in a social situation, if I'm at, someone's party, I'm always hanging out with my friends' parents, their mom or their dad. I gravitate towards like the next generation instead of not always my own. So I think this is a natural progression for me, even though some of them are my colleagues. I've always had this affinity for people who are older than me, at least a generation older.
Yeah, I think the key piece, the lesson I want people to hear is, number one, Vicki just simply tried stuff. It took a while, but you listened to yourself. And now you are so much more self-aware. You're so much happier.
Definitely.
And I'm sure your husband's a lot happier.
He is. I think he wishes I didn't work quite as much because even though I have 2 part-time jobs, I am busy, but it's a good busy. And I do have to keep that in check because sometimes I'm a little too busy and I'm able to set up my own schedule, particularly with Get Set Up. So sometimes I need to take a step back and say, do I need to tweak my schedule a little bit so that I have more time for me? And so at least I'm aware of that.
And there's a certain amount of timing here because both the boot camp you're working on and Get Set Up didn't exist prior to the pandemic.
Right.
Right. And I believe, and I've had Neil D'Souza on the podcast, who's the CEO of Get Set Up, that Get Set Up would have turned out very differently had it not been for the pandemic.
They were headed down a different road, so to speak. They had a different business model. And then when the pandemic hit, they actually decided to stop charging for classes and make them free for people, which is just incredible when you think about it. And that's why they have the following that they do today. Now, they are going to start charging a little bit for classes. They're trying to figure out how to move back into that model. But still, I just thought it was so incredibly generous of them.
Well, if you go back, I'll put the link to the interview I did with Neil. Part of it is that they're getting funding. They're getting funded by Medicare providers, state governments to open up their classes to certain clientele, and they're customizing it for that clientele.
Yes, that's pretty exciting because they've gotten a few really big accounts recently.
So, and I've got 3 or 4. I just published a blog post about, I believe, 4 people: Dev Livingston, Russ Eanes. I'm working to get Deb on the podcast. Bernadette Barton, and you. And I currently have another member of the community who's doing an unpaid guided taking people around Europe. And John is just moved back to the U.S. after living most of his life in Europe.
Right. Yep. I introduced John to Get Set Up.
And we've been encouraging him just to use this to experiment. To some extent, that's what you've done, is you've experimented.
And the way that I look at this is I am planting the seeds for the future. So I can't tell you what's going to happen next year, but I seem to have fallen into this population where, of older adults that I love what I'm doing. And so my hope, my idea is to do a good job, do it as well as I can, and then have other people recognize that. And hopefully there will be continuing opportunities elsewhere.
Yeah, I think you will find that this is going to open up a world to you. And, you're working virtually.
Yep.
And you get you have the best of both worlds.
I do. And I do want to let folks know that I'm not making millions of dollars doing this, but I'm in a position where I'm able to do this. And that also makes a big difference because at this point in my life, I am in that financial position where I have the ability to make less money. And that's helped too. That's also helped me make these different decisions.
Yeah, I'm going to have Debbie Schnurr on the podcast in a couple of weeks. And Debbie is interesting in the fact that she has gone from point A to point B to point C, never knowing where it was going to take her. But inevitably, all the dots tended to connect. And it's a great story.
Yep. Deb's a great person.
And it's allowing you to be open to open to serendipity.
I think that's a good way of describing it. Yep.
Right. The fact that it's just going to happen if you keep trying and you keep poking and you, like you said, you came through several jobs where they just didn't work out and they didn't, and that's okay.
Yep. And just being open to other opportunities, letting people know that you're open as well.
So, Vicki, if someone wanted to reach out and contact you, how might they do that?
The easiest way is through probably my email, which is vsoll352@gmail.com. I'm also on LinkedIn, and you can just search for me on LinkedIn and, direct message me there. VICKISOLL, just search for me on LinkedIn. So I'm happy to connect.
Well, Vicki, I really wanted you to come tell your story because I think you're an inspiration to folks within the community, although you find that hard to believe.
I do.
And the fact that I am incredibly proud of you because you kept trying and I saw you go dips and come back up. And I just see the difference in you now is pretty incredible.
Thanks, Mark. I really appreciate all your support. I really do.
So thank you very much for being on the Repurpose Your Career podcast.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Vicki was such an inspiration to others in the community as she tried different jobs, and obviously a lot of them didn't work. What we did not discuss is she specifically targeted telehealth as an industry, tailored her resume and LinkedIn profiles to get an interview. She did this very strategically, only to discover the job really sucked the life out of her. After only 3 weeks, she said enough is enough and quit rather than to suffer because her desire for an income. Each of these experiences pushed her to follow what was right for Vicki. I know that Vicki is not done yet. She will build on the experience she's getting working for Get Set Up to pursue even more rewarding work. Take a moment, go to careerpivot.com, sign up for the weekly Career Pivot Insights newsletter, which is sent out every Sunday. You will get a weekly update on this podcast, white papers, and new blog posts. While there, do not forget to check out the Career Pivot community, which can be found at careerpivot.com/community. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. You'll find the link in the show notes. Look for Career Pivot on Facebook and LinkedIn. You'll also find me on Twitter at Career Pivot. Thank you for listening all the way to the end of the Repurpose Your Career podcast. You will find all the show notes at careerpivot.com/episode-260. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Podbeam, Overcast, Spotify, Pandora, Amazon Music, and lots of other places where podcasts can be found. In fact, this podcast can be found on the Repurpose Your Career podcast channel on YouTube. Hope to see you next Monday for another episode of Repurpose Your Career podcast.